Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. So, my title is Evangelical White People Adopting Stolen African Children. And I wanted to start the video off by showing where I first actually discovered this. There and the Traffickers is on Netflix. And so it actually is an excellent documentary. Well, actually, it is in docuseries and crime TV shows where it shows a series of different exposes of things around the globe that are, it's either black market, from guns to gold to human body parts to illegal child adoption. And I thought this series was pretty educating, actually. And so I wanted to start my video off with where you can actually see it. And so I thought it was important to bring that out because I don't think people really realize that this is something that has, been happening for quite some time now, that people have been deceived. So I guess I'm going to try to go on to one of the articles that actually talks about this candidly. And so I don't know if you can actually see, but I'll just go on and start reading it. So give me a moment here. I'm actually trying to go back in here and share the screen. And so now when you have a lot of windows open, it doesn't come through. So let me see here. So I'm just going to do my best with reading this, and then hopefully the screen will come in. But, sometimes I have some trouble with this coming in. I'm actually trying to share the screen so that you can see. I kind of feel, that lately what they've been doing is they've been trying to make it harder for people to present topics, because I guess there's been a lot of channels, a lot of things that have come out more recently, and some people feel some type of way by it, and they a lot of things have been very truth-telling. And so with the climate that we're living in, where there's a lot of people who, are, angry about, our administration and politics, they usually will come to certain channels if they disagree with somebody. Maybe you're of a different background, or you have a different ideology or belief, or maybe you're revealing a lot of information that is truth-telling, and it sends a lot of conviction and anger. And so a lot of times they'll try to attach all that anger to people's platforms and attack people's credibility. And so a lot of times what I try to do is bring up articles or docuseries or different things that where information has come from. And it's actually really true. I try to stay more uh, real on topics and not bring up fake, um, you know, what they claim is to be fake news. I guess that's what they say. It's a fake news, and so I might have to see if um, I can now like finagle this to try to get it to actually present itself rather than, you know. So I don't know. Maybe it is shown. We'll see. So everything might be fine. But anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and read it, the article. So this article I'm reading here is called The New Republic. And let's see, the trouble with the Christian adoption movement. So Evangelical Americans believe adoption could save children in the developing world from poverty and save their souls. So this is by KATHRYN JOYCE. And this was in 2016, January 11. So I will leave the title and I will leave the information under my video. So if you're having trouble hearing it or seeing it, don't worry. I will try to leave everything in there so that you can actually read where I'm getting this from. So in 2009, a Tennessee couple made a life-changing decision. And so a devout Christians, they decided to open their home to an orphan girl from Ethiopia, whom they were told had been abandoned. And so let me start off by saying there's been some groups of people who have been not only lying to the African people, but they've also been lying, or the African parents, they've been lying to them, and they've been telling these parents that their kids are going to go to a good school in the States and that they're going to send the kids back to them once they've been educated. But what ends up happening, these African women are parents, never see their children again. And so these Christian groups or evangelical groups are sold these children. And I don't know if they're aware of what is going on. Some are not. Well, some now probably they are now aware of what is going on because they know now it is a racket. But I don't know if they know enough information as to what is going on. And what they're doing is taking these children and they're stealing them from African parents, lying to the African parents, and then they sell the kids off to a white family. And so this has been going on for some time. So there's a docu-series called The Traffickers on Netflix that actually, it talks about a series of things that have been going on around the globe. And so I would, will try to put that in my, underneath the video. So I'll just keep reading. So it says they knew enough from fellow adoptive parents to expect that the process would be long and hard. But as they were waiting for their application to go through, something unexpected happened. A number of Ethiopian staff at their adoption agencies were arrested for transporting children to a different region of the country where they could claim the children had been abandoned. So following the glut of adoption cases where children were said to have been abandoned in the capital city of, now some of these names are going to be like, excuse me if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, So the capital city is Addis Ababa. The court had temporarily stopped processing abandonment adoptions of children from the city, but were still allowing cases from elsewhere in the country. So the stories about where the children came from or whether they had been abandoned orphans whose parents were unknown, or their parents were poor and had willingly given them up. So that was the story that these people were fed. It seemed to change from day to day. So concern, but by now committed to the child they'd come to think of as their future daughter, the Tennessee family went ahead with the adoption. But as I wrote in my book, The Child Catchers, after they brought the girl back to the United States and she learned enough English to say so, she told them that she had another mother. And then when they called the newly adopted daughter was not an orphan. So, on a personal level, the news was devastating. So, the family felt like they had stolen someone's child. And so, wanting to find out the truth, they set off on months long and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to locate the daughter's biological mother, but their story turned out to be just one of many, a single example of the numerous incidences of adoption corruption that in the last several years have helped change the direction of a powerful adoption movement among U.S. evangelicals. So at the time of the Tennessee incident, adoption was preeminent. Evangelical social cause of the U.S. Beginning in the early 2000s, American evangelicals became one of the most powerful forces in international adoption, lining up devout believers to follow the biblical mandate that Christians care for orphans and widows in their distress. So this call would become a movement that launched major conferences, spawned a small library of books, adoption theology, and it changed the complexion of many conservative U.S. churches. And so in 2007, national Christian leaders like celebrity pastor Rick Warren encouraged their followers to shift their focus from the issues of moral purity, abortion, same-sex marriage, divorce, to something more positive that they claim, helping children in need. So more than just pro-life, it would be a whole life response to the long-standing pro-choice challenge that Christians adopt all the children they wanted to be born. So it would also be an extension of existing evangelical engagement with global development and health issues. Promoting adoption would help rebrand U.S. evangelicals from moral skulls to children's champions. And so they wanted a name for themselves. A lot of people are not very trusting of religious organizations for a lot of the scandals that have been uncovered, which this is another one, but it's actually lied to several people here. So the premise of the movement was a particularly American response to the global child poverty. It was based on the idea that the existence of somewhere between 143 to 210 million vulnerable children around the world. A number of that also includes those who live with one parent or extended family member, often in poor conditions, constituted an orphan crisis, but that there were also 2 billion Christians who could help. So if just a fraction of those claiming to be Christians stepped up to adopt, the movement's leaders argued parentless and hungry children as a category would cease to exist. So as one leader put it, the goal was to get as many people in the church to adopt and adopt as many kids as we can. And so evangelicals responded in a huge number. So churches began to create adoption ministries, praising and supporting adoptive parents and encouraging new families to adopt as well. And so it goes on to state that anti-abortion crisis pregnancy centers redoubled their efforts to cast adoption as a pro-life alternative to abortion. So evangelical adoption funds popped up, giving grants or interest-free loans to couples hoping to adopt. Okay. And so particularly pastors whose potential adoptions were viewed as a priority since they could set the example for an entire congregation. So in 2009, the Southern Baptist Convention, the second largest denomination of the U.S., passed a resolution directing all of the members to consider whether God was calling on them to adopt. So a coalition group, the Christian Alliance for Orphans, grew to encompass more than 100 evangelicals, nonprofits, and denominational groups united around orphan care. So in 2010, Bethany Christian Services, the largest group agency in the country, reported 26% jump in the number of adoptions, largely due to the mobilization of Christians newly interested in adopting. So the same year, when Haiti was rocked with the devastating 7.0 level earthquake, the Christian adoption movement became a full-blown cause. So the movement threw its weight behind efforts to expedite U.S. visas for unaccompanied Haitian children, so they could leave their country and enter waiting U.S. homes. So many prospective adoptive families inquired about Haitian earthquake orphans. Bethany Christian Services began diverting applications to other countries like Ethiopia, which were then undergoing adoption booms, thanks to a combination of poverty and lax laws. So the crisis and subsequent response also gave birth to the most notable scandal in the young Christian adoption movement, when a group of Idaho Baptists traveled to Haiti to gather orphans off the street with the intention of bringing them to an yet unbuilt adoption center in the Dominican Republic. So none of the children, it would turn out, were orphans. But just as Haiti, many of the children being adopted from the places like Ethiopia weren't orphans either. So as journalist E.J. Graff has extensively documented, the numbers cited that the orphan crisis are significant misrepresentation of UNICEF estimates that of vulnerable children. So also UNICEF representatives say that no accurate number exists for true orphans. That is, children with no parents and in need of a new home. So the organization estimates that 90% of so-called orphans have lost only one parent, and many of the remaining 10% live with extended family. So what that means is that many of the children who live in orphanages in the developing world, often because of poverty or because of the parents have no one to care for them while they work, as well as many children sent abroad for adoption, aren't real orphans at all. So the crisis at hand isn't so much an orphan crisis as a crisis of poverty, food insecurity, conflict, and a host of other less sensational development issues that have rendered children especially vulnerable. And so it goes on to say, but in the Christian adoption movement rush to do good, those complexities were forgotten along with the children's families. So the movement began to refer to the adoption as a means of redeeming orphans. So it's sounding like it almost looked like maybe they knew that there was something going on, but they went ahead with the whole plan anyway. So it goes on to say that they titled it Redeeming Orphans, saving them just as Christians are redeemed when they're born again, supposedly, and their families became either forgotten footnotes or ugly caricatures. So adoption agencies, anti-abortion crisis pregnancy centers that referred to mothers as to these agencies. The Christian ministries often cast domestic birth mothers as their selfless martyrs or hopeless promiscuous addicts, bad influences on whom children must be saved. So in international adoptions, birth parents were more likely to be erased, although the adoption agencies sometimes wrongly claimed that they were dead or dying. So members of the Christian adoption community sometimes spoke of the children in developing nations as indistinguishable mass, wherein any child of an impoverished parent was viewed as equivalent of an orphan and was labeled as such. So the stories of how children were a global epidemic of children left Moses like in a basket by police stations, dumpsters, and fields. So the reality of the course was more complicated. So many children were relinquished for adoption because of poverty alone. So some families who gave up the children for adoption later explained that they thought that the child would return when they were older, or that the adoptive family was becoming a sponsor of the birth family back home and would help them transcend their circumstances. On rare occasions, there were stories of how babies were simply bought or kidnapped. So ethical problems in adoption didn't start with this modern Christian movement. In the early days of the U.S. domestic, from 1854 to 1929, some 100,000 to 250,000 East Coast children were taken by workers at the Children's Aid Society and early child welfare organizations. So children were taken from inner city slums, put on orphan trains, and shipped to the West to be adopted. So sometimes the adoption took place as one might hope, a child legitimately welcomed into another family, and sometimes they were closer to a form of indentured servitude for the still settling West. Almost all followed the rationale of the orphan train movement's founding father, Charles Loring Brace, a 19th century progressive social reformer who founded the Children's Aid Society with support from philanthropists and businessmen. Brace argued that allowing children to grow up in their overcrowded Irish and Italian New York City homes would foster the development of a dangerous class of criminals growing up almost sure to be prostitutes and rogues. So domestic adoption took on a new life in the 1950s through the 1970s. So this period saw that the spread of the maternity homes where millions of unwed pregnant women were sent to live in confinement and deliver their babies in secret. What many of these mothers now call the baby scoop era, before relinquishing them into infertile couples. International adoption gained popularity around the same time, effectively starting in South Korea. Biracial, mail-order Korean infants were removed to the U.S. by the thousands, sometimes poorly another culture. So many of the earliest international adoptive parents were conservative Christians who shared the belief of Harry and Bertha Holt, the Oregon couple who pioneered Korean adoptions and whose ad hoc adoption program became the basis for the longest standing international adoption agency in the world. So Holt International Children's Services is what it was called. So as domestic adoption declined after the legalization of abortion and the increased acceptance of single motherhood, international adoption expanded dramatically to a wide range of countries. A pattern began to play out in the country after country. Initial demand followed by an influx of corrupting Western cash and an end game of coercion, fraud, and often eventual closure or suspension of the country's adoption program. So although American adoption law is complicated and domestic regulations vary from state to state, much of the legal framework for adoption developed over the last 50 years has been tailored to the interest of adoptive parents. This is unsurprising since those who adopt tend to be more powerful and richer than birth parents. So, additionally, a system of tax incentives and the subsidized individual adoption short windows for birth parents to revoke their consent, and sealed birth certificates that prevent adoptees from learning their biological history reinforce this divide in favor of the adopted parents. So when the Christian adoption movement was at its strongest in the late 2000s and early 2010, many of its excesses looked like a condensed version of the early problems with adoption. So as Christian adoptive parents lined up to help paying $30,000 to anywhere to $40,000 per internationally adopted child in fees that are divided among agency payments, travel, and orphan donations, their demand helped create new adoption markets. So this was particularly true in African nations where the combination of poverty, opportunism, and cultural misunderstanding of the meaning of adoption often was construed as temporary guardianship rather than permanent relinquishment of the child. So it led to children repeatedly being offered, or in some cases taken, for adoption based on mistaken beliefs or outright profiteering. And so that's the racket that's been going on, still going on to this day. So in an infamous 2009 example documented by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, a staff member for an American evangelical adoption agency was filmed leading what appeared to be a mass adoption recruitment effort, asking assembled residents of the rural Ethiopian village whether they wanted their child to go to America. So this movement built to such a pitch that even those within the evangelical community began to complain about miscarriages of scripture. So I have never understood some people's interpretation of the scripture, James 1, verse 27, where it says, visit orphans and widows in their distress, said Karen Riley, a child welfare advocate and devout Christian who works in Uganda. So by some people's actions involved in international adoption, you would think it said, visit widows, take their orphans, and leave them both in distress. So around 2010, a new set of problems began to emerge, and there were the proliferation of stories of the Tennessee family where children said to be orphans turned out to have having living families who in some cases expected their return. So in the US, some adoptive families caught up with the movement's mission based on the call to adopt as many children as you can, did so, ending up with the supersized families with sometimes tragic results. So some adoptive children were abused or even killed at the hands of their adoptive parents, like 13-year-old Ethiopian adoptee Hannah Williams, whose case I documented in 2013. A shocking number of stories emerged of children who had been sent away from their families, forever families, either to new and unvetted adoptive homes back to their countries of origin or just cast out on the streets. So to David Smallin, a law professor at Cumberland School of Law, as well as a longtime Christian advocate for ethical adoption reform, these adoption horror stories collectively amounted to a tidal wave of bad publicity. So the Christian adoption movement had expected good press and a secular pat on the back for having put their money where their mouth was. The response they received instead came back as a shocker. But if the movement grew rapidly, so did the recognition of the systematic problems plaguing adoption. A number of critics emerged, often Christian adoptive families, who had come to rethink the community's unquestioning focus on adoption as a solution to a broader issue of poverty and instability, and who challenged leaders to pay attention to their experiences. One couple, Caleb and Becca David, who adopted 2 Ethiopian children, ran short-term missionary trips for Christians to work with children in the country, told me that as incredible as adoption was, we'd be naive to think that it was the only answer. So we feel like our eyes have been open about the importance of holistic orphan care. But because ultimately it's not about us having our child. Additionally, generations of adoptees came of age and began to organize, starting rather organizations like Land of Gazillion Adoptees and Lost Daughters. These are adoptive organizations where they discuss their own stories in ways that few adoption advocates could ignore. So other adoptee organizations in South Korea and Ethiopia began to work directly with poor or single parents to help them avoid losing children to adoption. So as these stories began to be heard in the last several years, the Christian adoption movement was undergone a sea change, or it has undergone a sea change. So a number of its most prominent advocates, including the leadership of Christian Alliance for Orphans, have begun to focus on the forgotten half of the Widows and Orphans Mandate, the existing families of those orphans. So there's a practical reason for this shift as well. International adoption as a whole has contracted drastically with the number of children entering, and I'm looking, entering the US falling by 2/3 since the peak of international adoptions in 2004. So numerous nations slowed or shut down their adoption programs for a variety of reasons. China's economic development, for example, led to an increase of domestic demand for adoptable children. So Russia stopped sending its orphan children to the US for complicated political reasons. And I remember that. One of them was because they had a couple from the States that adopted a little girl. Now I'm off the article. And the mother, it was actually on a documentary as well, where the mother is jailed because she killed the little girl. She abused the little girl. And so Russia had stopped sending. That's why Russia had a problem. That's one of the reasons why they stopped sending their kids here to be adopted. And so, and now they probably, they will allow for adoption, but I believe, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong on that, because of that incident, it didn't go well. So they halted the adoptions for a while. So I don't know if they've lifted it, but they probably have, of course. But there was a case where a little Russian girl was abused really bad to the point to where she was murdered. Parents here in the U.S. So still others like Guatemala and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia reduced or stopped adoptions completely following corruption scandals involving children wrongly sent abroad. So as a result, scores of adoption agencies have gone out of business. And this summer, one of the most stalwart international adoption lobby organizations, the Joint Council of International Children's Services, closed shop as well. So 2013 bill drafted adoption advocacy organization and initially supported by Christian adoption leaders was designed to dramatically increase international adoptions, what many saw as the last-ditch effort to revive the failing industry. But it gained little support and ultimately it failed. So on the whole, says Smallin, the infrastructure for international adoption is crumbling, so the boom of previous years has begun to look like just that, an unnatural increase that was never sustainable. So part of the Christian adoption movement's change in direction, notes Smallin, is simply a reflection of this new reality. It's hard to continue forcefully adopting for international adoption when the supply has declined so much. So it's not that the Christian adoption movement has admitted being wrong about international adoption, he told me, but they just don't talk about it that much anymore because of the scandals that went on, where these kids were basically, the mothers, the parents in these countries were lied to, and the mothers were lied to. They were told their kids were going to go to the States for a good education, and those kids never came back, or if they ever came back. However, Smallin also sees a change of heart among Christian adoption advocates. Starting in 2014, the flagship coalition of the movement, the Christian Alliance for Orphans, began to back away from promoting international adoption at its annual conferences. And so I'm going to stop for a moment here. There are kids here, right here, that need to be adopted. And that's my question. Why don't they adopt the kids that are right here in the US rather than adopting kids from all the way from some country, and now you find out these kids were never really orphaned? And it just is sad. You know, it's like they're kids. I know personally that there are kids that don't have any home to go to. And I don't understand why these groups don't, you know, let's cut out all of that craziness and instead of risking this kind of stuff and adopt kids right here in the US. But anyway, let me go on. So, okay, the movement leaders invited Smallin to speak to their annual conferences as a critical voice from within, and the audience seemed increasingly sympathetic to his concerns. So Smallin, it seems like the movement has at last caught up with modern secular discourse about child welfare rather than make a messianic call for white U.S. evangelicals to save the third world children. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's like, you know, they're looking for these white Christian people to save the world after people like them kind of messed it up. You know, I won't say kind of, have white elites that kind of put people in that position to be this way. So the church has been wading into the thorny technocratic issues that dominate international child policy debates. And so today he said it is common to annual conferences to discuss whether orphanages are appropriate shelters for children and how to support domestic fostering and initiatives in developing nations. So it's not the same movement that it was, said Smallin. So I guess they have a new awakening about this. And so Jed Medefind, president of the Christian Alliance of Orphans, agrees that there has been a significant shift in the movement's emphasis. I'd note a steady maturing in understanding and priorities overall. So I think there's still a recognition that there are many children that do very much need families today, both in the U.S. foster context and globally. And that's exactly what I said. But more, I feel like a lot of kids here in the US need foster parents. So I don't know why they would go to that extreme to do all of that. But I guess because they feel that those are developing countries and they're without a lot of things, you know, like adequate education and healthcare and whatnot, that they be doing a service. But you know, when you see that this is a possibility that those kids are not really orphaned and that those poor people are being swindled and lied to, then you don't want to mess around with some of these fly-by-night agencies. But it goes on to say that also the counterbalancing desire to do all possible to preserve and reunify struggling families and to promote local adoption in developing countries. So some Christian adoptive parents who might once have been drawn to the movement have instead led the way in creating small local organizations in developing nations designed to help broker local adoptions or foster care initiatives, removing the profit motive from the question of the child's stability. So in Ethiopia, for example, one such group has worked to establish daycare centers for the children of working mothers so that they can, the women isn't forced to place a child in an orphanage in order to provide for the rest of the family. So in Uganda, they also have a nonprofit run by Karen Riley, Reunite, help support to resettle children wrongly placed in orphanages or offer for international adoption with their biological families, often after prospective adoptee families begin to suspect something is wrong and contact Reunite to investigate. Though a small organization funded primarily by donations, Reunite has to date helped place 35 children back with their Ugandan parents or other relatives. And so these are kids that also, they're African children that need to be reunited with their parents because they've been taken away from their parents and their parents have been lied to because this has been going on. They've been lied to because they sell the kids for profit. So these attempts are still small, but and don't yet have the same momentum or finance that the massive efforts to promote adoption once did. But on an ideological level, it amounts to a major shift in thinking. So over the course of a few short years, the Christian adoptive movement grew to reenact some of the most significant and troubling problems within the adoption industry. Its propensity to disregard or demonize birth families, to minimize the significance of the adoptive children heritage, to participate in the system that often needlessly separates families for profit. But many of these advocates have begun to recognize these problems and are now trying to make them right. And the larger organizations like Loomis, nonprofit founded by the author J.K. Rowling's book writer, we know who that is, who wrote Harry Potter, to combat unnecessary institutionalization of children in orphanages have bolstered the call. So the changes in the U.S. movement haven't completely solved the problems of adoption, but Riley said that the pace of adoptions in Uganda hasn't changed, and most of the adoptive parents she meets are still U.S. Christians. And as I've reported elsewhere, some of the old problems of the international adoption have been replicated among vulnerable immigrant communities now within the U.S. Additionally, for the many of thousands of children adopted during the height of the American international adoption boom, whether secular or religious, the decades ahead are likely to bring more questions and possibly years of searching for families they have left behind. And so this article is out of the New Republic, so I'll try to at least write the New Republic, and I'll write the title of the article so it can be relocated. So if you had a problem hearing it, if you had a problem seeing it, so that you know, if I see this video and you can see what's going on, but here, right here, see. And so this is an article, and this is coming out of CNN, and it also documents some of the troubles that have gone on. So if you can't see it, at least you can hear it. So I'm going to play it. It's entitled Kids for Sale.
Being severely neglected at home, and her mother was leaving her open to abuse.
Couldn't provide an education.
Yeah, never had been in
provide
school.
Daily sustenance.
They just kept saying this is a mother that does not want her child. So it was made clear to you that Mata's mother was relinquishing her, didn't want her.
Oh, 100%.
There's no question. No, not at all.
In April 2015, the Davises flew to Uganda to meet Mata, their new daughter.
She was in an orphanage, no toys, bars on the windows.
The orphanage was called God's Mercy, and it was about 4 hours from Mata's village. By September 2015, Mata was in Ohio, bonding with her new siblings. But after about 6 months, as Mata's English started to improve, she opened up to Jessica Davis about her life in Uganda, and what she shared was alarming. Mata told Jessica that her biological mom was a really good mom who loved her. She even detailed how her mother there would walk her to school every day.
Every single thing in that file and that we were told, aside from the file, she unraveled to be a lie.
A lie? How could that be? Jessica alerted the U.S. State Department.
What did you tell the State Department? Everything that she had told me, everything was not true. And it sounds like she has a mother out there that really loves her, and possibly a father.
What were you afraid you'd find?
That we had somehow participated in taking a child from a loving family.
Yeah. Their fears would be realized. Jessica contacted an organization run by Karen Riley, who actually found Mata's biological mother in Uganda and arranged a video reunion.
Why are you so excited, Mata?
Because I get to talk to my mom.
How nice. Are you happy?
Yeah.
We are doing fine. How are you? Randi.
And in that moment, everything changed. The real story of why she was given up by her mother to this family in America was exposed.
With that FaceTime call, she learned
The true story.
that her mother was tricked.
Tricked, the Davises say, because Mada's mother was lied to. She was told the Davises were simply sponsoring her daughter's education in America, not adopting her. And that, if you can believe it, was just the tip of the iceberg. Because the Davises have learned their experience is not unique. In fact, a CNN investigation has discovered that multiple families have been duped. It works like this. Children are being taken from their homes, placed in orphanages, even though they weren't orphans, then sold for as much as $15,000 a child to unwitting American families. The promise of education with an ultimate return home, all just a ruse.
They will hone in on vulnerable families, usually being single parents, widows. Would you like an education opportunity for your children?
Karen Riley, who is an advocate for Ugandan children and runs a group called Reunite Uganda, says a villager turned trafficker usually makes a sales pitch to mothers at a local church. Mada's village, she says, was targeted.
That's how it all started at the beginning, is the person came to the church. And that's what happened in that particular village. The 7 children went from a tiny village to the same village.
This affidavit from the Ugandan government's investigation, one of many documents obtained by CNN, has a statement from Mada's mother. I had not realized that I had gone through a process to take away my parental rights completely. She states clearly she thought Mada was going to be educated and returned back to me.
I don't want to see another mother
Yes.
go through this.
A Ugandan court says Mada's referral form to God's Mercy Orphanage is fraudulent. It says Mada's mother is helpless. The reason given for referral, no care is provided by the mother. The referral form is dated October 21st, 2014, exactly 1 week after the Davises say they got the call that Mada was available for adoption. At the time of that call, the Davises now believe Mada wasn't an orphan at all, but still living at home with a mother who loved her.
If our child had been taken from us,
Yeah.
we would want our child back.
So the Davises did something remarkable. They filed paperwork to have the adoption vacated. They would take Mada back to her birth mother.
Did you have the State Department's blessing? They were saying, you can just keep her if you want. I said to them, I didn't purchase her at Walmart.
I did not.
Yes, you did.
1 year after they brought Mada home to Ohio, this.
So, Mada, what's today?
I'll go home.
Are you excited?
Yeah.
Are you going to Uganda?
Yeah.
What's the first thing you're going to do when you see your mom?
Hug home.
Aw.
Is this a long flight or a short flight?
No.
After a 14-hour journey, Mada finally arrived home to her village. In September 2016, the Ugandan government officially gave parental rights back to Namada's biological mother. But Jessica's story wasn't unique. Enter Stacey Wells.
I just wasn't in it to buy a child. I didn't need a child.
Stacey Wells and her husband Sean already had 2 sons, but in 2016, they adopted 7-year-old Viola from Uganda. They worked with, you guessed it, the same company the Davises used, European Adoption Consultants. They too paid around $15,000 to the company. They say that agency told them a story strikingly similar to Namada's, but this time it was about Viola. What did they tell you about her mother?
They just said that she had abandoned the girls, that after the dad died, they told us that she didn't feed them, that they were found sick, like dying, basically.
Viola, it turns out, was taken to the same orphanage as Mada, God's Mercy. But later, at her new home in West Virginia, as Viola became fluent in English, the truth started to unfold.
A lot of it was how she talked about her mother. Her experience in her home just did not match the paperwork.
Stacy, who spoke exclusively with CNN, also contacted Reunite Uganda to find Viola's biological mother. Karen Riley told us Viola's mom was also lied to by local traffickers, using the same false promise of education in America.
Viola wasn't an orphan. In fact, she was made an orphan
She was
so you
made-
could adopt her.
Right.
Stacy traveled back to Uganda in November 2016 and reunited Viola with her mother.
I mean, she was just running, and we get out, and her mother just embraces me.
Viola's adoption was a fraud, and Stacy says it's all about money.
They are getting the orphans because there's a dollar sign. You know, a market's been created.
A market for children with a pipeline, it appears, back to the United States, which is where European Adoption Consultants is headquartered, and where we found the director of EAC's Africa Adoption Program. You helped organize the Uganda adoptions.
No, there was people in Uganda that did. I did not.
Were these mothers lied to?
No, absolutely not.
Randi joins us now. I mean, the story, what happened to these families, the girl, it's obviously heartbreaking. How many families could be affected here?
It's hard to say how many other families, Anderson, were misled or tricked, but we may have just scratched the surface, actually. We have been told about at least 2 other girls from Uganda. They're actually Viola's sisters who were adopted by American families, and so far, those women have been unwilling to reunite the girls with their mother in Uganda.
So you mentioned the orphanage where Mata and Viola were taken. Is that still open?
The Ugandan government has told us, Anderson, that orphanage has actually been closed. They found that they were operating illegally, processing guardianship orders fraudulently, and yes, trafficking children. We weren't able to reach anyone from that orphanage to ask about this since it has been closed. But meanwhile, the FBI and the State Department have been investigating EAC and its ties to this alleged trafficking scheme. In fact, last year, the State Department debarred and shut down that adoption agency for 3 years after finding that EAC failed to adequately supervise its foreign country providers to ensure that they didn't engage in the sale, abduction, or trafficking of children. No charges have been filed against EAC, but the FBI told us the investigation is ongoing, Anderson.
And so that is the conclusion of this video.
But are these
Your thoughts, your comments, and feedback on this video, let me know. And thanks for listening.